I never imagined that the words that would shatter me would come from the very man I once idolized. It was supposed to be a celebration. My father's retirement after 40 long years of building Anderson Development into a powerhouse that defined the city skyline. The ballroom glistened that Saturday night at the prestigious country club. Gold chandeliers spilled light across polished marble floors, and a string quartet played softly in the corner. 200 of the city's elites stood in clusters, swirling champagne in crystal flutes, their laughter bubbling louder than the music. And there I was, standing in the middle of it all in my simple black dress. No sequins, no designer label, just something modest I had pulled from the back of my closet. Compared to the gowns shimmering around me, it made me feel naked. But I had come for him, not for them. My father, Robert Anderson, the man everyone in this room revered, stood at the podium with his silver hair gleaming under the lights. He looked proud, confident, every inch the self-made mogul. My mother, Margaret, hovered at his side, flawless as always in her diamond necklace and tailored gown, smiling that perfect society smile. When he began to speak, the room fell silent. He thanked his business partners. He honored his loyal employees. He praised my brother Michael, the golden child who was already stepping into his shoes. And then slowly his eyes landed on me. I thought just for a moment that maybe this would be my chance. Maybe he would finally acknowledge me, his daughter who had taken a different path, who had chosen art instead of steel and concrete. Maybe he would say he was proud of me in his own way. But instead his lips curled in a sneer. "And then there's Linda," he said, his voice carrying effortlessly across the hushed ballroom. "The biggest disgrace to this family." The words hit harder than a slap. Gasps rippled through the crowd. My champagne glass trembled in my hand, the bubbles suddenly bitter on my tongue. He didn't stop. While Michael built his career and carried our name with pride, Linda chased childish fantasies. Art, sketchbooks, exhibits no one attends. She's 32 years old and still living like a rebellious teenager. Do you think that makes a father proud? Every eye turned toward me. Pity, judgment, amusement. I could feel them all burning into my skin. My cheeks flamed red, my throat tightened, but I forced myself to stand tall. In that moment something broke inside me. The last fragile thread of hope that he might someday see me for who I was, not who he wanted me to be. It snapped. And in its place something new began to take root. Not shame. Not defeat. But fire. I smiled. Just a small, dangerous smile. And as he finished his speech to thunderous applause, I knew there was no going back. That night I decided I would no longer be the black sheep. I would no longer beg for scraps of validation. Instead, I would show him and everyone else in that glittering ballroom that the so-called disgrace would rise higher than the golden sun. And when I was done, they wouldn't just know my name. They would regret ever underestimating me. But to understand the weight of that night, you need to know where I come from. The Andersons have been a prominent family in this city for 3 generations. My grandfather laid the first brick with a small construction company that slowly grew into a real estate empire. My father inherited it and spent 4 decades shaping the skyline. A man praised in newspapers, honored at galas, envied by rivals. My mother perfected the role of the society queen, chairing charities, hosting dinners that made the social columns, and ensuring every detail of our lives gleamed with polish. And then there was Michael, my older brother. Harvard Law, top of his class. 10 years at the most prestigious firm downtown before becoming a partner. Married his college sweetheart Patricia in a fairy tale wedding covered by magazines. A mansion, a perfect life, a flawless heir to the empire. He was everything they dreamed of. And then there was me. From the time I could hold a crayon, I was sketching. While Michael played with toy trucks and bragged about skyscrapers, I filled notebooks with faces, landscapes, worlds that existed only in my imagination. I didn't want boardrooms or contracts. I wanted canvases, colors, galleries. To my family, that wasn't ambition. It was rebellion. "You'll never make a living with this nonsense," my father used to bark when he found me bent over my sketches. "Stop embarrassing me with your childish fantasies." Even my mother, always calm and refined, would sigh. "Linda, darling, art is a hobby, not a future. Your brother is building something real. Why can't you be more like him?" But I couldn't stop. I wouldn't. And so I became the disappointment. The disgrace. The black sheep they paraded reluctantly at family events, hoping I'd stay quiet, smile politely, and fade into the background. Until that night when my father decided to humiliate me in front of 200 of the city's most powerful people. He thought it would break me. Instead it became the spark. Because that very night, standing under those golden chandeliers, I made a promise to myself. I would rise. And when I did, my father's words would haunt him forever. When I left that ballroom the night of my father's retirement party, the city lights outside looked different. The champagne still fizzed in my veins, the echoes of his insults still rang in my ears, and every step I took away from that club felt heavier. But sharper too, like walking on glass and realizing you could bleed or you could learn to run. I remember standing in the parking lot, my black dress brushing against my knees as luxury cars glided past me. Guests laughed, tossed their coats to waiting valets and congratulated each other on being part of Robert Anderson's legacy. None of them looked at me. Not one. But I didn't care anymore. In that moment, humiliation became fuel. And I decided something that terrified even me. I was going to build a legacy of my own, not to compete with Michael, not to please my father, but to burn their arrogance to ashes. The next morning, my phone buzzed with messages. One from my cousin Anna. Are you okay? What your dad said. I couldn't believe it. One from Patricia, my brother's wife. Don't take it personally, Linda. You know how he is. And one from my father himself. Next time, wear something appropriate and don't stand so close to the podium. Not a word of apology. Not a trace of shame. Just more control, more blame, more proof that he didn't even think he'd done anything wrong. I sat in my tiny one-bedroom apartment, scrolling through those words, my hands trembling with something that wasn't sadness anymore. It was rage. And with rage came clarity. I opened my closet, pulled out the old portfolio I hadn't touched in months, and spread the sketches across the table. Faces, buildings, landscapes, ideas that had been trapped in my notebooks because I'd been too afraid to believe in them. My heart pounded as I flipped through the pages. I wasn't worthless. I wasn't a disgrace. My art wasn't a hobby. It was power. And I was going to use it. At first, I didn't know where to start. I worked days as a freelance graphic designer, just enough to pay rent but never enough to matter. At night, though, I began a new routine. I stayed up past midnight researching galleries, art residencies, competitions. I read stories about artists who had clawed their way into recognition. I watched interviews with creators who had turned rejection into fire. I taught myself the business of art. Not just how to create it, but how to sell it, how to market it, how to make people see what they'd ignored. And slowly I began building something. I started an online page, anonymous at first, just posting sketches and paintings. Within weeks, strangers commented, "This feels alive." I'd hang this in my living room. "Do you sell these?" For the first time, people saw me. Not as Robert Anderson's daughter. Not as Michael's sister. But as Linda, an artist with a voice. Of course, my family didn't notice. At Sunday dinners, my father still talked only about Michael's firm, Michael's deals, Michael's clients. My mother bragged about Patricia's charity galas. And when they turned to me, it was only to ask condescending questions. "Still doodling, dear?" my mother would ask sweetly, sipping her wine. My father would smirk. "Maybe one day you'll grow out of it." And Michael, well, he didn't even bother. I smiled back, nodded politely, and kept my secret close to my chest. Because I knew what they didn't. Every insult was a brick in the tower I was building. Every dismissal was fuel for the fire. And one day that fire would burn bright enough for them to choke on the smoke. The turning point came 3 months later. I had submitted one of my larger paintings, a sprawling cityscape bursting with surreal colors, to a regional art competition. I didn't expect anything. Honestly, I submitted it just to prove to myself I still could. And then one Thursday morning I got the email. "Congratulations. Your work has been selected as a finalist. Please attend the gala next month." I stared at the screen until the words blurred. Then I screamed so loud my neighbor knocked on the wall. It was happening. It was really happening. The night of the gala, I walked into a different kind of ballroom. This one was filled with curators, collectors, critics, not businessmen and lawyers. The chandeliers sparkled just the same, but the air buzzed with creativity, not contracts. When they called my name as one of the winners, my knees almost buckled. The applause wasn't polite or obligatory. It was real. Genuine. For me. And that night, when a local magazine interviewed me and asked where I drew my inspiration, I said something I knew would make my father's blood run cold when he eventually read it. I was inspired by rejection. By being told I was worthless. By realizing that sometimes, the greatest fuel comes from the people who doubt you most. The article went viral locally. My online following doubled overnight. Commissions poured in. Suddenly I wasn't just surviving. I was thriving. And yet I kept quiet at family dinners. I didn't tell them about the article. I didn't mention the award. Not yet. Because revenge is best served not with anger but with patience. And I was going to let my success grow louder and brighter, until they couldn't ignore it anymore. But fate has a cruel sense of humor. Because just as my star began to rise, my father reached out with a request I never saw coming. My father called me a disgrace in front of 200 people. 3 months later he called me something else, useful. The email arrived at 6:12 a.m., stamped with the Anderson development letterhead like a seal on a decree. From Elaine Porter, VP Communications. Subject: Legacy Commission Opportunity. Mr. Robert Anderson would like to discuss a commemorative artwork for the new Anderson Development Headquarters atrium. He believes you may be the right artist for the job. I read it twice, then a third time as if the words might sprout fangs and reveal their true shape. Not apology. Not I was wrong. Just, useful. I could hear his voice through Elaine's polished corporate language. Come perform for the empire you refuse to worship. I replied with one line. I'll consider a meeting. Then I called Sophie. You're not going alone, she said. And you're not going without terms. Terms, I repeated, tasting the word like steel. Good. I've been waiting to speak a language he understands. The lobby of the Anderson Tower felt like walking into a glass cathedral. Cold, pristine, built to make you small. I didn't dress like a supplicant. I wore black trousers, a crisp white shirt and boots that added 2 inches and a lot of nerve. Elaine met me with a smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. Linda. We've all seen the article. Congratulations. Thank you, I said, because I have manners even when I'm planning revenge. In the boardroom, my father stood with his back to the skyline, hands clasped behind him like a general about to deliver terms of surrender. Michael sat at the table, tie perfect, jaw already tight with disapproval. A tray of untouched pastries proved that no one had an appetite for pretending this was friendly. Linda, my father said, indulging my name like a favor. You're getting attention. Let's put that to good use. For you, I said. For all of us, he corrected, eyes flaring. The city expects a statement piece in the new HQ. A % for art requirement. He flapped a dismissive hand, plus optics. Your name helps the narrative. The narrative where you don't have a daughter you publicly humiliated, I said lightly. Elaine's smile froze. Michael's pen clicked once. My father's gaze hardened to granite. This is an olive branch, he said. Don't snap it. I set my folder on the table and slid out a single page. Before we discuss art, we discuss terms. Michael actually snorted. Terms? You should be grateful for the exposure. Exposure is what people die of on mountaintops, I said. My studio doesn't accept it as payment. Elaine's brows lifted. Your studio? Black Sheep Studios, I said, and enjoyed the flicker in my father's eyes. Registered last week. I read the page aloud, crisp, clean like a verdict. 50% deposit upon contract execution. Creative control. Final sign-off on all design decisions by me alone. Public credit on plaque and all materials. Commissioned artwork by Linda Anderson, Black Sheep Studio. No alterations without my written consent. Access to site and archival materials. Timeline, 6 months. Final 50% on installation day. My father's mouth tipped in a cold smile. You've learned negotiations. I learned them by listening to you talk at dinner, I said. And by reading your contracts when no one thought I was paying attention. He scanned the page, then looked up. We'll pay 40 now, 60 on completion. 50. I'm not your intern and I'm not your son. Michael stiffened. What's that supposed to? Enough, my father said. He kept looking at me like a puzzle with one missing piece he was too proud to search for. Then, with the faintest nod to Elaine, draw it up. He thought he'd won. He thought he'd bought me. He had no idea he'd just paid for his own mirror. The site visit landed on a gray afternoon, The kind of light that flattens a city into charcoal. Hard hats, safety vests, a supervisor named Reyes who kept calling me ma'am, and apologizing for the dust. The atrium was a cathedral of glass and steel, an open cube big enough to swallow my childhood home. The brief, legacy, the Anderson story, ambition, vision, family, was carved across the meeting deck like a commandment. Tell me about the workers, I said. Reyes blinked. Which workers? The ones who built this, I said, sweeping a hand to the bones of the space. Names. Where they're from. How many hands touched that beam, that seam, that line? He looked at me like I'd asked for the building's heartbeat. We can pull rosters. Why? Because buildings don't rise with speeches, I said softly. They rise with hands. That night, Reyes emailed me a spreadsheet. First names, last names, crew assignments, injuries reported, days worked. I read every line. I wrote down 20 stories from 20 strangers, the quiet biographies that never make it into glossy annual reports. I knew what I would build. I pitched a triptych installation, inheritance. 3 vertical panels rising 4 stories, brushed steel, etched glass, layered resin. From a distance, it would read as a luminous cityscape, a tribute to the skyline Anderson loved to claim. But embedded in the glass, in micro-etched lines and layered text, would be the names of the workers who raised it, the neighborhoods displaced by earlier Anderson projects, the dates of safety violations that got buried in footnotes, the quotes from city council transcripts where politicians swapped progress for campaign checks. It would be beautiful. It would be undeniable. And to anyone who looked closely, it would be honest. Elaine called after I sent the concept. It's powerful, she said carefully. But we'll need to keep focus on the Anderson legacy. We will, I said. A true legacy is the whole story. 2 beats of silence. Robert will want edits. Robert already signed the clause, I said. Creative control. Another silence, this one heavier. Understood. I hung up and let my hands tremble only after the line went dead. At Sunday dinner, I said nothing about the commission. My mother complimented Patricia's dress. My father recounted a golf game where a city councilman happened to be on the next tee. Michael talked about a client who got away with a thing he shouldn't have bragged about. Still doodling? My mother asked like a reflex. I smiled. Still building. My father looked up, alert to the verb. I spooned potatoes onto my plate and let him sit with the not knowing. Later, Patricia caught me at the sink. I saw your piece in City Weekly, she whispered. I cried. Don't tell Michael I said that. He'll call it performative. Thank you, I said and meant it. Allies bloom in the strangest soil. The first payment hit my account. I bought panels, rented a larger studio, hired 2 assistants from the community college. Nadia, who welded like a poet, and Jamal, whose grandmother had marched to save a public housing complex that Anderson later bulldozed for luxury urban homes. We worked late with music low and coffee high. We etched names until our fingers cramped, burned through drill bits, learned where steel sings and where it swallows. I recorded everything, design logs, emails, photos with timestamps. Not paranoia. Difference. Midway through month 2, Michael called. Dad wants to see progress. Tonight. Tonight isn't available, I said. He can schedule a review next week. Through Elaine. You can't freeze us out, Linda. We're the client. You're a client, I said. And you signed a contract. He laughed, brittle. God, you've always loved playing difficult. No, I said. I've always loved playing fair. You just never liked the score when you didn't write the rules. He hung up. 5 minutes later, Elaine texted a polite request for next Tuesday at 10. I confirmed. I could feel my father boiling through the phone. They arrived like an audit. My father, Michael, Elaine, and a junior associate whose job was to look important. The panels leaned against the studio wall like sleeping giants. I pulled the dust sheets. The room breathed in. From across the space, the triptych glowed, city lines rising and folding, a river like a scar, light catching in etched channels that read as pure design. Elegant, Elaine murmured, nodding. My father stepped closer. His reflection fractured in the glass, multiplied and sliced. He reached out, paused, and then, maybe because he couldn't stop himself, he looked too closely. That's when he saw the names. What's this? He said, the words low. The hands, I said. The people who built your building. The ones who poured your foundations, welded your beams, riveted your legacy. His jaw flexed. We didn't agree to. We agreed that I have creative control, I said quietly. And a legacy that omits the hands that made it is just vanity. Michael stepped in. And these footnotes? Public record, I said. Dates of OSHA citations. Eviction counts by project. Quotes from council meetings. Nothing defamatory, nothing secret. Just the truth visible. My father turned on Elaine. This is unacceptable. Elaine didn't meet his eyes. Her job was optics. Her soul, I suspected, was tired. You wanted a statement piece, I said. This is a statement. We wanted our statement. You hired an artist, I said. Not a typist. Silence stretched, taut and dangerous. Then my father did what powerful men do when the room refuses to bow. He smiled without warmth. Deliver on time, he said. We'll deal with the rest. He left, Michael on his heels. Elaine lingered. It's brave, she said softly once the door closed. Be ready. For what? For the part where they try to unsign the thing they signed. I nodded. That's why I have another clause. She looked at me curious. I didn't elaborate. Some traps you spring only once. 2 weeks before installation my father made his move. A lawyer's email, not Michael's. He keeps his hands clean, claimed brand misalignment, demanded minor edits, and attached a mock-up where the names had vanished, replaced by the Anderson mission statement in gold leaf. I forwarded the email to my attorney. Yes, I had one now, a gallery counsel named Priya who smiled like sunlight and bit like winter. She made one call. Then she sent one letter. Breach of contract if any alteration is attempted. Injunctive relief ready, press package prepared. The next morning Elaine texted, proceed as planned. I didn't smile until I was off the phone. Installation day arrived pre-dawn, the city's veins just starting to pulse. Reyes's crew handled the rigging like choreography. Nadia cried when the first panel rose. Jamal saluted it like a flag. As the third panel locked into its mounts, light poured through the atrium and the names began to glow, thousands of etched letters shimmering like a constellation only visible to those who bother to look up. Elaine stood with a tablet, checking the program for the grand opening gala. The mayor, the press, the ribbon. You're speaking, she said. I am. I hadn't planned to. It says, artist remarks, 2 minutes. I glanced at the triptych, at the quiet truth sleeping in its skin. 2 minutes would be enough. 2 minutes could change a room. Fine, I said. 2 minutes. Keep it positive, she added, reflex more than warning. Truth is positive, I said. It's just not always flattering. She didn't argue. The night of the gala felt like the retirement party's ghost. Chandeliers, suits, camera flashes. But I wasn't the girl in the plain black dress anymore. I wore a tailored midnight blue suit and a thin silver line at my throat like a blade. Sophie squeezed my hand. Nadia and Jamal stood just inside the crowd, beaming like they'd smuggled fireworks. My father worked the room like a king, Michael trailing him like a shadow. When the lights dimmed, Elaine took the podium, then the mayor, then my father, Robert Anderson at his most polished, delivering a speech about vision, ambition, legacy. I watched the reflection of the panels in the glass beyond him. The building listened. And now, he said, the artist. 100 faces turned. I stepped into the light. Art can be decoration, I began, voice steady. It can be propaganda. Or it can be a mirror. I turned and gestured to the triptych. This is a mirror. From far away you see the skyline, the story we like to tell about growth, success, triumph. But come closer and you'll see the hands that built it. Names etched into glass. Stories braided into steel. The truths we step over when we hurry to cut a ribbon. A murmur, the kind that means people aren't sure whether to clap yet. This piece is called Inheritance, I said. Because a real inheritance is not a company or a plaque. It's accountability. It's the courage to tell the whole story. Silence settled, thick, charged, the moment before a storm chooses its direction. Then someone near the back began to clap. Another joined. The sound gathered itself, halting at first, then steady. Not thunderous. Not unanimous. But real. I glanced at my father. His smile was carved from ice. I could have ended there. I should have. But I didn't. I took one last breath. My father once called me the biggest disgrace to this family, I said quietly. Tonight I'm grateful. Because disgrace taught me something ambition never could. How to stand up alone. This work is for the people who never get a microphone. Tonight they have one. I stepped back. The room divided itself. The powerful shifting, recalibrating. The workers' families in the back. Ray's had invited them. Of course he had. Wiping at their eyes. The press writing faster. My father approached the podium again, applause thinning as he touched the mic. He spoke like a man smoothing napkins over spilled wine. Thank you, Linda. A thoughtful perspective. Now shall we cut the ribbon? He thought he had saved it. But I had only just set the stage. Because tomorrow, when the photos ran, when the close-ups revealed what the panels actually said, when the names and dates and quotes refused to unetch themselves from glass, the story wouldn't be the speech. It would be the mirror. And mirrors are merciless. The email from my father's assistant sat on my screen for nearly an hour before I opened it. Robert Anderson requests your presence at a strategy meeting for the Anderson Development Expansion Project. Tomorrow, 10 a.m. Downtown headquarters. I read it over and over again, certain it had been sent to me by mistake. Me? Invited to a strategy meeting? My father had never trusted me with anything beyond setting the table at family dinners. But no, it wasn't a mistake. He wanted me there. And deep down I knew why. 3 weeks earlier, the magazine article that had featured my art had landed on his desk. I didn't need confirmation. I could feel it in the timing, in the way he suddenly wanted me close. For years I was invisible. Now, when my name was making waves, when people whispered about the Anderson daughter who might actually matter, suddenly he remembered I existed. I almost deleted the email. But then I thought about that night at the country club. His voice, cold and sharp. The biggest disgrace to this family. Well, if he wanted me in his office, I was going to give him a show. The next morning, I walked into Anderson Development's glass tower. It smelled like money and marble polish, every detail screaming of power. The receptionist blinked when I introduced myself. Robert's daughter? She repeated as if the concept didn't fit. Inside the boardroom, my father sat at the head of the table, Michael to his right, and a half-dozen men in suits surrounding them. Their conversation stopped the moment I entered. Linda, my father said, his tone clipped. Glad you could finally make yourself useful. Useful. That word made my skin crawl. I took a seat, meeting Michael's eyes. He smirked, the same condescending smile he'd worn my entire life. They spent the next hour talking about blueprints, acquisitions, projections. My mind drifted until suddenly my father turned to me. You've been dabbling in art, he said, his lip curling. Some of our investors suggested we incorporate a more modern aesthetic into our new project. They thought perhaps you could consult. Lend a feminine touch. It wasn't respect. It was exploitation. He didn't want me because he believed in me. He wanted me because my name was now worth something to parade in front of investors. And that's when I realized this was my chance. I leaned forward, my voice steady. Of course, I'd be happy to consult. But I don't work for free. And I don't take credit under someone else's name. The room went quiet. My father's eyes narrowed. Excuse me. I smiled sweetly. If Anderson Development wants my vision, they'll present me as the creative director of this expansion. My name on the project. My signature on the designs. Michael scoffed. You can't be serious. You're an amateur. I met his gaze. Funny. The critics didn't think so. And from what I hear, your investors are more excited about my art than your contracts. My father's jaw tightened. I had him cornered and he knew it. If he shut me down, he'd risk losing the very investors he was trying to impress. Fine, he said finally. But don't embarrass us. The men in suits shuffled uncomfortably, whispering. Michael glared daggers at me. But I only sat back, hiding the storm of triumph boiling inside. This was the first crack in their empire. And I was the one holding the hammer. Over the next few weeks, I poured myself into the project. The building design became a canvas, not just of steel and glass, but of bold strokes of color, light, and form. Investors adored it. They called it visionary, a modern masterpiece. And every time they praised me, I saw the resentment deepen in my father's eyes. At home, the tension grew worse. Michael confronted me one night after a meeting, his voice low and dangerous. You think you can waltz in and steal the spotlight? This company is mine. Always has been, always will be. I tilted my head. Funny. That's what Dad used to say. And look at him now, passing the torch to someone younger. Maybe history repeats itself. His face turned crimson. For the first time in my life, I saw fear in his eyes. The unveiling of the project was set for the following month. A grand event, press invited, speeches prepared. And that night, standing on stage in front of 100 cameras, I presented my designs. Not as Linda the Disgrace but as Linda Anderson, creative director. The applause was thunderous. Reporters swarmed me. Flashbulbs blinded me. And in the corner of the room I saw my father watching. His expression was unreadable, pride twisted with rage. He had wanted me as a puppet. Instead, I had stolen the stage. I lifted my chin, smiled at the cameras and thought, this is only the beginning. Because revenge isn't just about proving them wrong. It's about making sure they can never forget they were wrong. Success is a strange thing. When you're ignored, no one notices your footsteps. But the moment you start shining, every eye is on you, not with admiration but with envy, suspicion and fear. That's what happened after the unveiling. One week I was the disgrace of the Anderson family. The next I was in magazines, online features, even invited to speak on a podcast about art and architecture. People wanted to hear my story and I gave it to them. Carefully, strategically, never lying but never letting my family's cruelty go unnoticed either. I talked about rejection. I talked about resilience. I talked about turning humiliation into fuel. And the more I spoke, the more people listened. At family dinners, the atmosphere grew colder by the week. My father barely spoke to me, his pride choking him every time I received praise. My mother smiled tightly, pouring more wine than usual. But while Michael was unraveling, one evening as the plates of roasted lamb were passed around the table, he snapped. You think this little art stunt makes you important? He spat, his fork clattering against the china. You're still nothing. You're still the same pathetic failure you've always been. The room went silent. Even my mother flinched. I looked him dead in the eye, calm as ice. Funny. The investors don't seem to think so. Neither do the critics. Maybe the only one who does is you. My father's jaw twitched. My mother reached for Michael's arm but he pulled away. That night I realized something important. I wasn't just challenging my father's authority anymore. I was threatening Michael's inheritance. And he knew it. Meanwhile, the project continued to soar. Investors were thrilled, press coverage was glowing, and my name appeared more and more alongside Anderson Development. But success always has a cost. One morning, I walked into the office and found a copy of my sketches shredded across my desk. No note, no explanation, just a quiet warning. Michael walked by moments later, whistling. I didn't flinch. I gathered the scraps, threw them away and got back to work. Because the truth was, I had already made digital backups. Every design was safe. His petty sabotage was nothing compared to the storm I was preparing. The storm came sooner than I expected. A journalist reached out to me, not about my art but about Anderson Development. Rumors of shady deals, under-the-table contracts and safety violations. Linda, she said over the phone, you've been on the inside recently. Have you seen anything unusual? I froze. For years I'd heard whispers. My father's company wasn't as pristine as it looked. But I had never cared enough to dig deeper. Till now. That night I went back through old files, old emails, old whispers Michael had carelessly dropped over drinks. And slowly a picture began to form. They weren't just arrogant. They were corrupt. And if I played this right I could expose them. The next few weeks were a blur of research. I traced contracts, cross-checked permits, highlighted inconsistencies. Every lead took me deeper into a maze of fraud and greed. But the most shocking discovery came late one night, when I stumbled across a file labeled Project Redwood. On paper it was a housing development. In reality, it was a money funnel. Inflated invoices, fake subcontractors, millions disappearing into consulting fees. And at the center of it all was Michael's signature. I sat back, staring at the glowing screen. My hands trembled, but not from fear. From exhilaration. This wasn't just revenge anymore. This was justice. The opportunity to strike came at a charity gala hosted by my mother. The ballroom glittered with chandeliers, diamonds and fake smiles. My father basked in the praise, Michael paraded Patricia around, and I slipped quietly among the crowd. When the speeches began, I stepped forward. "I'd like to make an announcement," I said, my voice carrying across the room. Heads turned. Cameras clicked. My father's smile froze. I lifted a folder. "For years, Anderson Development has presented itself as a pillar of this community. But behind the polished image lies fraud, corruption, and exploitation. Tonight, I present evidence of Project Redwood, a scheme that stole millions from investors and endangered the lives of families promised affordable housing." Gasps filled the room. My father's face drained of color. Michael surged forward, but it was too late. Screens behind me lit up with documents, signatures, proof. The silence shattered into chaos. Reporters swarmed. Guests whispered. And for the first time in my life, I wasn't the disgrace. They were. That night, my father's empire began to crumble. Investigations were launched within days. Michael tried to deny everything, but the evidence was overwhelming. My father went silent, refusing interviews. My mother locked herself in her mansion, too embarrassed to face her society friends. Me. I walked through the city streets with my head high, knowing I had done more than prove them wrong. I had destroyed the illusion they built on my back. But revenge has a cost too. And as much as I relished my victory, I knew the war wasn't over. Because men like Robert Anderson don't go down quietly. And Michael was just getting started. The fallout of Project Redwood didn't just rattle my family's reputation. It cracked their empire wide open. Within weeks, the company's stocks plummeted. Investors withdrew, lawsuits piled up, and the name Anderson turned from prestige to poison in the business world. And yet somehow my father still held his head high. When the press asked about the documents, he waved them off as a misunderstanding. When regulators pressed for answers, he hid behind lawyers. And when Michael was cornered, he insisted he was innocent, claiming forged signatures, fabricated evidence, anything to save himself. But I knew the truth. And I wasn't finished yet. One rainy evening, as I sat in my apartment surrounded by stacks of files, I received an unexpected message. "You don't know me, but I know what Anderson Development did. I used to work for them. Meet me. Midnight. Pier 14. For a moment I hesitated. It reeked of a trap. But my instincts told me this was important. I went. At the pier, a man in a worn jacket waited. His face was pale, his eyes tired. "They ruined me," he said. "I was a foreman on Redwood. When I questioned the budgets, they blacklisted me. No one would hire me. I lost everything. But I kept copies. Proof. Things you didn't show at the gala." He handed me a flash drive. And in that instant I knew. This was the nail in their coffin. The evidence was damning. Not just fraud, but negligence. Materials substituted with cheaper, unsafe alternatives, bribes paid to inspectors, and emails where Michael and my father joked about cutting corners for profit. If the Redwood scandal had shaken them, this would bury them. I reached out to the same journalist who had first contacted me. This time I didn't just hand over files. I handed over everything. Names, dates, transactions. "This," I told her, "is the real story." The exposé hit like a bomb. Front-page headlines screamed, "Anderson Empire built on lies." Television anchors dissected every email, every forged document. Families who had been cheated out of homes came forward. Former employees told their stories. And in the middle of it all was Michael's name. My father, Robert, was painted as the mastermind. Michael as his eager accomplice. My mother, though not directly implicated, was branded complicit through silence. The empire my grandfather built, the legacy my father worshipped, the inheritance Michael lived for, it was all reduced to ashes in a matter of weeks. The arrest happened quietly early one morning. Police cars rolled up the driveway of our childhood home, their flashing lights staining the perfect white columns of the mansion. Neighbors watched from behind curtains. Reporters huddled on the lawn. Robert Anderson, the man who once stood tall at a podium and called me a disgrace, was let out in handcuffs. Michael followed, shouting protests, his face red with fury. I stood across the street, hood pulled low, and watched. For the first time I saw them stripped of power. No suits, no titles, no applause. Just men caught in their own greed. And God, it was beautiful. But victory didn't taste as sweet as I expected. Because beneath the triumph was grief, not for them but for what could have been. For the father I wished I'd had. For the brother who might have stood by me. For the family dinners that could have been filled with laughter instead of venom. That night as I returned home, I poured a glass of wine and stared out the window. My phone buzzed with congratulations. Colleagues, friends, strangers who admired my courage. And yet what I felt most was freedom. The weight of their disapproval, their cruelty, their control. It was gone. Finally, I was free to be Linda Anderson without apology. The story didn't end there. With Anderson Development in ruins, investors approached me directly. They wanted me to design, to lead, to create without chains. My art was no longer dabbling. It was a career, a future, a legacy of my own making. And I vowed to build it on truth, not lies. On passion, not greed. Months later, I received an invitation in the mail. It was for a retirement party, another one. This time, hosted by the firm that had taken over the remains of Anderson Development. They were honoring the fall of an empire and the rise of new voices. I almost laughed. But I went. Standing in the same kind of ballroom where my father once humiliated me, I raised my glass. Not to him. Not to Michael. But to myself. To the disgrace who became the headline. To the outcast who became the architect of her own destiny. To Linda Anderson, the daughter who wasn't supposed to matter, but who rewrote the story anyway. As the crowd cheered and cameras flashed, I smiled. Because revenge isn't always fire and fury. Sometimes it's quiet. Sometimes it's simply standing tall, watching those who tried to bury you sink under the weight of their own sins. And sometimes, it's raising your glass at the same kind of party where you were once destroyed, but this time being the one everyone applauds. The storm that followed Project Redwood didn't just rattle my family's reputation. It gutted the empire my grandfather built brick by brick. Within days of the expose, the company's stocks collapsed. Loyal investors, once eager to shake my father's hand, now scrambled to distance themselves. Lawsuits rolled in faster than they could be counted. And suddenly the Anderson name, once spoken with reverence, became a byword for greed and corruption. Still, Robert Anderson, my father, tried to bluff his way through. The evidence is fabricated, he barked at reporters outside our old headquarters. My daughter is bitter. She's trying to ruin me. Michael echoed his lies, red-faced and sweaty, insisting the documents were forgeries. My mother didn't speak at all, but her silence screamed louder than any denial. What they didn't know was that I wasn't finished yet. One late night when I thought the war was over, a message slid into my inbox. You don't know me, but I know Anderson Development. Meet me. Midnight. Pier 14. I stared at the words. Could have been bait, some desperate trick. But my instincts hummed with something else. This was real. At the pier, under the shadow of rusted cranes and the sound of waves slapping against wood, a man waited. His jacket was torn, his eyes haunted. They ruined me, he whispered. I was a foreman on Redwood. When I questioned the budgets, they blacklisted me. No work, no future. My family left. But I didn't leave empty-handed. He held out a flash drive. And on it was more than proof of fraud. It was proof of negligence. Emails where my father and Michael laughed about using cheap materials. Ledgers showing bribes slipped to inspectors. Permits rushed through without safety checks. This wasn't just corruption. This was endangerment. This was a scandal that would stain them forever. I didn't hesitate. The same journalist who'd broken Redwood met me at a cafe the next morning. I slid the flash drive across the table. This, I told her, is the story you were meant to write. 2 weeks later, the world knew everything. Headlines roared across every platform. Anderson legacy built on lies and neglect. Newscasters replayed the emails. Families cheated out of safe homes wept on television. Politicians demanded action. Robert's empire didn't just fall. It disintegrated. The arrests came quietly but decisively. Police cruisers slid into the driveway of our childhood mansion at dawn. Neighbors pressed their faces to windows as men in dark uniforms strode up the marble steps. Robert Anderson, the man who once sneered at me in front of hundreds and called me a disgrace, was led away in handcuffs. Michael followed, his protests echoing across the street. He screamed about lies, about betrayal, about me. But none of it mattered. His name was scrawled across contracts and signatures too damning to deny. My mother stood at the top of the stairs, face pale, lips trembling, clutching a silk robe around her shoulders. For the first time, I wondered if she saw clearly what she had chosen all her life. Appearances over truth, loyalty to power over love. I didn't wave. I didn't smile. I just watched. And God, it was glorious. But when the door slammed on the police van, an ache lingered in my chest. Because victory, I realized, doesn't erase the past. It doesn't rewrite birthdays spent alone, tears swallowed in silence, the desperate hunger for a father's approval. That night, I poured a glass of wine in my small apartment and let the city lights spill across the room. My phone buzzed with congratulations, strangers calling me brave, colleagues praising my strength. But the loudest sound was quiet. The silence of freedom. For the first time in 32 years, I was no longer under Robert Anderson's shadow. I was Linda. Just Linda. And that was enough. Still, the story didn't end there. Investors who once worshipped my father now sought me out. Your vision is fresh, they said. You build on truth, not deceit. We want you to lead. And I did. The gallery shows turned into contracts. My designs found their way into real buildings. My sketches, once ridiculed as a hobby, became blueprints for schools, libraries, homes. Structures built not on greed but on purpose. I was no longer the Anderson disgrace. I was Linda Anderson, architect of something greater. A legacy not bound by blood but by choice. Months later, an invitation came. The gala. The firm that absorbed Anderson Development was celebrating the rise of new voices and the fall of the old guard. I almost laughed. But I went. The ballroom glittered under chandeliers, the same kind of setting where my father once humiliated me. But this time I wasn't hiding in the corner. I wasn't shrinking under his glare. This time I was the one everyone applauded. As I raised my glass, I thought of that night at the retirement party. My father's voice, sharp as a knife. You're the biggest disgrace to this family. And I smiled. Because sometimes the best revenge isn't shouting. It isn't rage. It's standing tall in the very place they tried to break you and knowing you won.